Human beings often imagine themselves as independent thinkers, yet history shows that obedience to authority is one of our species' oldest reflexes. This isn't simply cultural, it is psychological and evolutionary. From childhood onward, we are trained to comply, with parents, teachers, leaders, systems. This instinct becomes dangerous when obedience collides with morality, creating situations where humans will follow directives even when they intuitively know they are wrong. Long before civilization, tribal societies relied on elders and spiritual leaders for survival decisions. The cost of defying authority was exile or death, so obedience became synonymous with safety. Even if a leader made irrational choices, followers often complied because the group's cohesion mattered more than personal judgment. This ancient framework, where dissent meant danger, forms the evolutionary bedrock of why obedience still feels like the safe choice today. As religions emerged, obedience took spiritual form. Gods were invisible, so priests became interpreters, human authorities claiming divine justification. Obeying authority was no longer just socially prudent, it became existential. Doubt meant sin, punishment, or divine wrath. Religious obedience often demanded submission even when rules contradicted lived experience. From this period onward, moral judgment was outsourced to clerical authority, conditioning societies to treat obedience as virtue. With kingdoms came a new form of obedience, political power anointed by divine legitimacy. Monarchs claimed their rule was sanctioned by heaven itself, placing their commands beyond moral scrutiny. Subjects followed orders not because they trusted individual kings, but because the institution of kingship was presented as sacred and immutable. The concept of loyalty to the crown over personal ethics became a defining pattern of the medieval world. In feudal systems, authority was structured through rigid hierarchy, kings above nobles above knights above peasants. Each layer enforced obedience from the one beneath it. People internalized their role as fixed and predetermined. The very idea of challenging authority became unthinkable because identity itself was defined by one's place in the pyramid. To obey was not merely expected, it was who you were. In medieval Europe, the Church became the ultimate arbiter of truth. It dictated morality, knowledge, and acceptable thought. Individuals obeyed priests and bishops because they were taught to trust them more than their own reasoning. Heresy was punished brutally, reinforcing the lesson: independent thinking was dangerous, obedience ensured safety. This period entrenched the belief that authority knows better than the individual. As colonization spread, obedience was enforced not only among colonized peoples but also among colonizers who obeyed imperial directives. Soldiers, administrators, traders, many followed orders to exploit, subjugate, or destroy cultures they scarcely understood. They justified actions with appeals to duty, nationalism, or civilizing missions. Few resisted because disobedience meant dishonor, punishment, or social ostracism. The Industrial Revolution replaced feudal obedience with corporate obedience. Workers were conditioned to follow instructions within rigid routines: clock in, clock out, don't question the foreman. Human beings became components of a system. Bureaucratic structures made obedience impersonal. Orders came not from a person, but from the company, diluting responsibility and moral accountability. Modern states developed administrative hierarchies where obedience was embedded in procedure. Officials executed policies they didn't design, citizens followed laws they didn't shape, and soldiers enforced rules they didn't question. Responsibility dissolved through layers of command. Individuals acted as instruments of broader systems, distancing personal morality from institutional directives. With the invention of newspapers and later radio and film, obedience gained a new driver: narrative control. People began accepting information not from direct authority figures, but from media institutions that shaped public perception. Governments realized they no longer needed to command citizens directly. They could shape what citizens believed, and obedience would follow naturally. When the story is controlled, so is the audience. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of nationalism, where obedience shifted from king or church to the abstract idea of the nation. Citizens followed state commands because they believed they were serving a collective destiny. Personal morality was overwritten by duty to country. This set the psychological stage for mass mobilizations, wars, and unquestioned compliance to political leadership. During World War I, millions of ordinary men enlisted, fought, and died following military orders they rarely understood. They charged into machine gun fire because authorities said it was necessary. Whether out of patriotism, fear of cowardice, or pressure from community, obedience drove mass sacrifice. The scale of unquestioned compliance proved that humans will follow authority even when commands appear suicidal. After World War I, economic collapse and social instability made populations psychologically vulnerable. When life feels uncertain, people crave direction. Charismatic leaders emerged, offering certainty, identity, and order. Obedience wasn't forced, it was volunteered. People traded freedom for psychological comfort, demonstrating that fear and instability create fertile ground for authoritarian influence. The Nazi regime engineered obedience through propaganda, ritual, uniformity, and ideological indoctrination. Citizens obeyed not only out of fear, but belief that authority was righteous. This period represents one of history's clearest examples of moral blindness under authoritarian influence, where individuals participated in atrocities while claiming they were simply doing their duty. After World War II, many individuals on trial defended themselves by claiming they were merely obeying orders. This infamous rationale revealed a disturbing psychological truth. People often separate their actions from their moral responsibility when acting under authority. The trials forced humanity to confront a difficult question: is obedience an excuse, or a moral failure? In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram conducted his iconic study on obedience. Volunteers believed they were delivering painful electric shocks to another person at the command of a researcher. Despite hearing screams of agony, 2/3 continued to maximum voltage simply because an authority figure calmly insisted they must continue. The experiment proved that ordinary people can be compelled to inflict harm simply through authoritative suggestion. Philip Zimbardo's 1971 simulation showed that when people are given roles of power, obedience and authoritarian behavior emerge rapidly. Guards became abusive, prisoners became submissive. The environment created the behavior. The experiment demonstrated that systems, not just personalities, manufacture obedience and cruelty, revealing how quickly humans adapt to hierarchical expectations. During the Cold War, obedience was tied to ideological loyalty: capitalism versus communism, East versus West. Citizens internalized political identities as moral identities. Dissent became synonymous with betrayal. Fear of being labeled subversive or unpatriotic maintained compliance. Authorities no longer needed brute force. Social labeling enforced obedience through internalized anxiety. In the late 20th century, corporations refined obedience into professional compliance. Employees were rewarded for reliability and punished for dissent. Phrases like team player became euphemisms for conformity. Even when morally questionable actions occurred, misleading reports, unethical marketing, silent complicity, workers often obeyed to protect income, reputation, and career trajectory. Modern obedience became less visible but deeply internalized. Law enforcement presents a unique obedience structure where officers must follow directives while simultaneously exercising judgment, yet often default to protocol over conscience. The defense of procedure becomes a shield against moral accountability. When institutions prioritize obedience over discretion, individuals are conditioned to enforce rules even when they contradict ethical instincts. The badge becomes both authority and justification. Even after World War II, the military remained the clearest example of structured obedience. Orders must be executed rapidly, unquestioningly. Soldiers are trained to react to commands, not debate them. This conditioning, while operationally effective, creates moral dilemmas when orders conflict with conscience. The tension between personal ethics and military duty highlights how obedience can override humanity in moments of violence. Schools subtly reinforce obedience: sit still, raise hand, follow rules, accept authority. While structure supports order, it also socializes compliance, discouraging questioning, dissent, or innovative thought. Standardized testing rewards conformity, not imagination. The result is a population trained from youth to equate good behavior with obedience, shaping adults who instinctively defer to authority. Today, obedience isn't enforced physically, it is nudged psychologically. Algorithms amplify approved narratives and bury contradictions. People believe they are thinking independently, yet many opinions are influenced by curated information streams. Digital platforms reward conformity with social validation and punish dissent through ridicule or exclusion, making obedience feel like belonging and disobedience like isolation. In modern society, experts, scientists, analysts, and commentators serve as new authority figures. People outsource understanding to specialists and often accept conclusions without critical evaluation. While expertise is valuable, blind trust creates a new form of obedience, one that rests not on force, but on intellectual dependency. We assume the expert must be right, even when they might be wrong. One of the strongest modern obedience drivers is social pressure. Humans fear humiliation, ostracism, or being labeled difficult, extreme, or irrational. This makes silence the safer option. People obey not because they agree, but because they fear standing alone. In many cases, the greatest authority is not a leader, but the collective judgment of peers. Individuals rationalize obedience through mental strategies. I'm just doing my job, I don't make the rules, it's not my responsibility. This distancing allows harmful actions without guilt. When people stop viewing themselves as moral agents and begin seeing themselves as instruments of a system, obedience becomes effortless and responsibility evaporates. Across history, some individuals resisted: whistleblowers, revolutionaries, moral objectors, truth-tellers. Their defiance often came with personal cost: imprisonment, exile, assassination. But these moments show that obedience is not destiny. Humans can choose conscience over compliance. These dissenters often reshape moral boundaries and transform societies, proving that resistance is the engine of progress. Obedience enables civilization. We need rules, coordination, structure. But the same instinct can enable tyranny, atrocity, and ethical collapse. The paradox is that obedience is both essential and dangerous. The challenge is not eliminating obedience, but balancing it with moral responsibility. Authority must be earned, not assumed, questioned, not trusted blindly. To resist harmful obedience, individuals must cultivate critical thinking, analyzing claims, questioning motives, recognizing manipulation. Personal ethics must remain anchored internally rather than outsourced. When individuals understand their agency, obedience becomes a choice rather than a reflex, transforming citizens into participants rather than instruments. The story of humanity is a story of following, but also of awakening. Authority will always exist. The question is whether we surrender our judgment or sharpen it. If we learn from history, we can obey wisely, with eyes open, conscience active, and responsibility intact. If this exploration expanded your understanding of why humans obey, subscribe for more deep historical psychology from behavioral historian